Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Today, we're going to be talking about teacher burnout, administrative burnout, some of the challenges that we're facing with our education workforce here in the US. I'm joined today by Nate Eklund, who's the founder and CEO of a company called Vital Network. Vitalnetwork.com is the website. We'll include a link to that and Nate's book in the show notes. But before we get into any of that, Nate, I want to welcome you to the show. Welcome to Trending in Education.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's
It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And you've been working on these real issues around, job design and engagement among our teaching workforce and the people who lead them, which is a huge problem. I think COVID brought it into focus for a lot of us, but you've been on this for quite some time. Will we start by getting to know you a little better? Can you share with us your background, your professional origin story?
Yeah, absolutely. And can we be judicious with the you've been at this a long time thing with my
Sure.
gray hair?
I
Gray
can edit
hair.
that out.
Yeah.
No
Yes.
one will hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, I started my career as a high school English teacher. So I taught for about 13 years, largely in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Also taught overseas in international schools briefly right after my wife and I got married. So I spent the early part of my career there in the classroom and loved it. I loved teaching. I loved my students. I loved my administrator, my colleagues,
Yeah.
the community. So I had a really powerful, wonderful period of my own career. So I actually, despite the last 20 some years of my life being dedicated to burnout, I was
Right.
fortunate enough not to really experience that, at least not in an acute fashion. But I am a curious person and an entrepreneurial person. So I also knew that I probably wasn't going to teach or do any job for 40 years.
Right.
So I met with a life coach and she suggested that maybe I'd become a life coach, but I didn't really know what that was
Yeah.
going to look like.
Right.
I actually ended up getting a 2-year research grant, and that was my pathway out of teaching, but remaining in education to look at burnout, retention, and how we make schools engaging, remarkable places to work. So I really went into the employment side of education.
Mhm.
And so, as you noted, the result of my 2 years of research was not a PhD, but I did publish a book on the topic called How Was Your Day at School?
Mm.
And the title, albeit a little pithy, I think was born out of this idea that, our students, I have 2 sons, any one day of going to school really was predicated on really great relationships, feeling successful. Were they seen and heard? Were they valued?
Yeah.
And adults really aren't different.
Yeah.
And so I dedicated my career really to looking at the environments inside of schools. So I stayed in and around that book and speaking and training for a bit, then really realized that I didn't want to speak or just write. I wanted to do the work. So I started a
Right.
small consult, cleverly named Eklund Consulting. And for a decade, worked with districts and schools across the country. Can we identify areas where, from the employment side, from the adult side of the ledger of education, we can be really strategic, really concise around what improvement can look like on those day working conditions? And in so doing, can we increase connection, engagement, retention, decrease burnout and isolation? And so I spent a whole decade really learning in and from the field. And Vital Network is an extension of all of that. And that says, okay, we've done this work and research for 10 years. How can we scale some of these solutions? How can we really start to think about the health of the whole profession, not of just this one district or this, one region, but can we really think about how it is that we can transform the ways that we think around employment in education?
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, I think there was increased awareness of the problem, particularly when teachers became frontline workers during COVID, during the great reshuffle, the great realignment, the great reawakening, where a lot of people revisited their career paths and a lot of folks questioned whether they wanted to stay in the teaching profession. A lot of boomers started to retire really across the workforce. I do a lot of episodes about workforce trends. And interestingly, teachers get touched on there, but I don't know if they're almost, I think frequently folks assume we're going to talk about teachers when we talk about education writ large. And frequently they're not caught up in the progression, like positive innovation that's been happening around how the private sector and good workplaces think about engaging their workforce, think about compensating them, career paths, a lot of those things that are pretty common within a private organization. They don't always translate over into an educational setting, particularly in K-12. I imagine I was joking with you, as the Nostradamus of teacher burnout in the 2020s. I'm sure
Yeah.
you've been sort of grappling with this stuff, and it sounds like there are like known research based ways to address these problems. Can you kind of flesh out the context a little bit better for us?
I'll go back into my own story briefly and just say that when I was even researching burnout in education or workplace development in education, there was little to nothing to research. And so I was drawing on research that was being done in healthcare,
Yep.
in a law, how they bring students through that. I had to get into these tangential spaces really to look at it because it's pretty thin
Mm,
around how we look at education workforce development in
yeah.
K-12 education. I will say that I think we've gained a lot of knowledge
Right.
across the field.
This was back around 2008, 2009, something like that.
Mid-op,
Yeah,
is that a thing?
that is.
Can I say
You
mid?
did it.
Yeah,
Well
cool.
done.
Yeah, the book was published in 2008, research from 2005 to 8.
Yeah.
And again, since then, I'm happy to report that we've done a lot better thinking, clear, more cogent thinking around it. But more broadly, I don't think that K-12 currently really does look at sort of retention. That's the blind spot where Vital Network really focuses the vast majority of our time, energy, resources, and research is
Mhm.
around helping organizations to rethink retention. Because if you look at state policy, federal policy, and then just general public discourse, so much of our conversation is around recruiting new educators. How do we incentivize? How do we have
Yeah.
multiple pathways of licensure? How do we get young people to consider the profession? And then we also think about pension. We think about how do we ethically, responsibly reward these people for finding careers in education.
Yeah.
And where in the middle though is the job, like the
Right.
time that you actually are doing the work.
Right.
And when we think about the ROI of some really innovative recruitment efforts, if you recruit someone into a workplace that is not satisfying, is not going to be commensurate with both salary, benefits, but also just the lived experience,
Yeah.
you're not going to stick around. So our work really tries to look at the organizational level of what is the day-to-day working experience of educators. How do we increase their voice and value to make sure this is a great job? It is always somewhat jarring at times when what I don't hear being talked about when we think about workforce development and sustenance in education is how do is it that we keep the educators who we already have at least longer, right? I mean,
Right.
if you're going to think about from an organizational standpoint or even a state or federal standpoint, if we
Yeah.
have people who are going to quit after 3, stay for 5, or
Right.
quit after 5, stay for 10, I mean, the sustainability of organization and of student learning is profound.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there's a double impact there, right? There's the sunk cost and everything you lose when that talent leaves your building and you have to train it up again. There's no real replacement for that experience. So you have to start fresh, but then also the impact to the school culture, the school climate, when there isn't that sense of continuity, that sense of like these fixtures, these people who are leaders, both at the teacher level, which is an interesting career trajectory where there are those folks who really kind of comprise the culture classroom to classroom, but then your research and your focus has also extended into principals and folks sort of in the administrative space within K-12 who even at a more fundamental level create that culture. And when you see that churn at the principal or the superintendent level, I imagine there's even more profound effects.
Yeah, I mean, you're painting a bit of an accurate portrait, I think, of really the volatility of high turnover environments or industries, right?
Mhm.
And so there are really hard costs. We know that there's lots of research around the estimated costs around teacher replacement, and some estimates like the $25,000 range of just of sunken costs in bringing on new people and the costs associated with that. So there's a financial
Yep.
massive burden. There's loss of student learning. I think there's some research that say that when a teacher leaves, it's about a half year of learning for
Yeah.
young people.
Wow. Mm.
But then you have a bunch, and you already cited this, you have a lot of intangibles. I remember watching colleagues leave the profession, and that comes at a cost to me. First of all, I liked these people and was sad
Yeah.
to see them go.
Right.
Second of all, it called into question my own sort of engagement to the profession. And, I'll just point out it's also a bit of a fascinating environment to be having this conversation due to some real human dynamics. We're so student focused and community focused, and rightfully so. And I think it should be the gold standard of how we view the profession. But by the same token, I think the idea is that we're going to focus on our own dynamics, our own environments, our own
Yeah.
experience. At times sounds as though we're taking something away from students. Like, oh, I would love to do this work, but what about the kid? And I don't know if this is good news or bad news, Michael, but I would just say that the staffing levels nationally have gotten to the point where I no longer feel like I'm kind of approaching this problem twice. Historically, I had to maybe work with the superintendent and say, you better invest in these people or they're going to go and you're going to have a hard time keeping your buildings fully staffed. Convince that human being of that kind of use case and then say, but I'm here to help.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think anyone thinks that keeping schools fully staffed is a problem anymore. It is ubiquitous. Yes,
Yeah.
it is generalizable. And
Yeah.
so now it is really, we can accelerate in our conversations with our district partners. Okay, well, let's start getting really concise and on point about what we can do
Yeah.
to sort of fix that leaky bucket. You mentioned administrative turnover and churn. Currently, it's almost outpacing our teacher attrition rate. And we know that it takes 3 to 5 years for an administrator to really feel like, she's hit her groove and really starting to find that footing. But we have more administrators leaving the first years of their career right now. And so they're also not getting that time and that runway to do that good
Yeah.
work. And then that has deleterious effects on staff. So yeah, it is, the algebra here it can be a little jarring, but it
Mhm.
also can be really inspiring because if we can have that leader grow place and develop that staff culture in place that matriculates to those students, then we really have these sustainable cultures.
Yeah. And it does get to that level, as a parent of a 6-year-old right now here in Brooklyn who's in the public schools in this community. It's a great public school here. Shout out PS10 here in Brooklyn because Ms. Scott, the principal, has been there and she founded the school and she kind of built a culture there that you can feel. And it's the after school program and all the services. You can kind of get the sense of there's a cohesive thinking that went into the design of these things and everybody's kind of bought in. I'd say that's probably exceptional. And I feel very fortunate that we have that. But it's that old William Gibson quote, the future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed. How do we start to sort of spread that out so it's not an exception? Like, do you look at case studies and try to replicate them? Or, what sort of interventions do you do to kind of start to move the needle on teacher engagement and retention?
It's a really great question. And I think your point is well met. Generally speaking, job satisfaction is a really local affair,
Mm,
right? Sometimes even within a building, you go to a high school and the science department might be rocking it, and
yeah.
my beloved English teachers, maybe we're not. So I think we can really look at that sort of granular level. I
Yeah.
would also say the story of your school and Mrs. Scott would really be around kind of accidental greatness, right? I mean, that
Mm,
you happened to be in the right school in the right neighborhood at the right time with the right leader.
yeah.
And so what Vital wants to infuse into that is design. How
Mm,
can we design, replicate without thinking of it, I'm not talking about a franchise model, but really
Right.
how is it that we can look at it? So our research focuses primarily on three pillars that we look at organizationally. So we look at time management,
Mm.
voice and decision making, and measurable levels of care and support. So we start all of our work with staff surveys that just gives us a baseline
Mhm.
from which we can work. We generally work at the building level because we recognize in a district with 20 schools or 40 schools, whatever, they could be separated by 3 blocks and wildly different experiences. So we
Yep.
work directly with building leaders and teacher leadership teams. So while we
Yeah.
do have really robust, meaningful data, we are more of a process company. How do we
Yep.
bring people together to move towards co-solutioning? How is it that we add the dissemination of useful strategies from one school to another? That's kind of the network piece
Hmm.
of how we view it. And knowing that this strategy over here that worked really well probably couldn't just be lifted directly over to this environment, but can they learn from that experience, make it their own, create that dynamic that allows them to target those growth areas? We bring a lot of that learning up then to the district level because obviously buildings are operating within that ecosystem.
Yeah.
How's the district working with buildings, for example, to make sure their voices are heard in decision making? Their
Right.
time is managed well. Do we really look at that? And then increasingly, I think, and probably I would envision beyond that, how do we work within state governments, regional associations, and maybe even federal education someday,
Yeah.
depending on where that, if there is such a thing, can we then bring lessons from the field up that has an impact at the policy level as well?
Hmm. Yeah. I recently was talking to Lindsay Wharton from the Holdsworth Center in Texas, where they're looking at almost like the job design and the org design of K-12 and exploring where it might benefit from some rethinking. Because it does feel like some of these jobs aren't really sustainable. And, in addition to tactics that might help, with culture and teacher voice is something, student voice and teacher voice and community voice, all three of those legs in the stool need to be recognized. And I think frequently folks overlook teacher voice, to your point. But, are there different ways to structure a school or different ways to think about the responsibilities of a teacher, the responsibilities of a principal or a superintendent? Because it does feel like some of those models are maybe, 75, 100 years old now, depending on how you want to think about it. Do we need to start reimagining how we structure and design these jobs?
That's a great question. I'm a bit conflicted, I think, as I think through the nature of the question and then the outcome of what that could look like.
Hmm.
I think at face value, the answer is yes. I think we need to approach the idea of people loving their careers in education and staying there in meaningful, purposeful work is going to require, it is a creative act. So I agree with you that I think there's ways of structuring even time. The time scarcity is probably the number one
Right.
challenge that we face in our own work with people. Oh, this is going to be another thing, another
Mm.
initiative.
Mhm.
And so we really work to make sure that we
Got it.
establish these partnerships and trust that we are actually here for the long haul to affect change over time.
Yeah.
And I think within that though, is that can we create creative environments where people can own solutions to their own lived problems or their own lived stressors?
Yeah.
Are some of the outcomes of that a design process? Absolutely. So it can be really in the minutia. I mean, we'll have people, their October faculty meeting was 75 minutes and was 74 minutes of sitting and listening. And their November faculty meeting was teacher led and solutions focused and community
Mm.
building. And so in those 30 days, they had one experience that was unfulfilling and one that is on the path towards something different.
Yeah.
And so I think we do try to take a design approach. I've joked that the road to burnout is paved with good intentions. So I do think education has this unique opportunity to ask the kinds of questions that Vital asks. And that is, how do we create these environments, relationships, and systems,
Hmm.
these behaviors, and these protocols that support folks really at that daily level and with boots on the ground level.
Hmm.
There's a certain aperture to this work. I think you can, if you look out too far, you sort of miss like what's in
Yeah.
front of us. And a lot of the work that we do is, can we look down in front of us? Where are our current
Right.
modalities, our current ways of operating, and can we reinvent those collectively?
Yeah.
I think we have a little bit of bad news that leads to some good news. And over the decades now that I've been doing this work, we have a couple survey questions that I think are really important. One is, I find teaching to be an important job, and that's like taps out the Likert scale, right? I mean, I think that there's this deep
Yeah.
investment in it. I am good at what I do is actually a pretty robust number as well.
Hmm.
People self-identify that I am good at what I do. But the third leg of this anecdote is, I would recommend teaching as a career to young people. And the bottom drops out. It
Mm.
is creates gap in perception around the profession. So
Yeah.
we actually have a profession that is decruiting.
Mm. Yeah.
And the litmus test, I think, for our work, can we do such high quality work with schools, and really, can they do such high quality work with one another, that we actually would have people then say to their students, you should do this, or have students observe their educators and say, I want to do that.
Right.
And then I think the same thing goes with administrators. Can we have rising educators view the work of administrators having a profound and meaningful career and impact on schools and communities, and aspire to that? I would not say confidently right now that probably the observed experience of a typical American school administrator, maybe it looks.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky spot because I feel like within the current system, I've been talking to more people lately about horizons thinking, where, in some ways you have to address the immediate crisis because we are in a crisis. And how do we kind of bridge out into something better next, which I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on. But then there's also, some real questions around, do we need to think about how we would design this fresh? Like if we did this as something new, would we bake in some things like, I was just thinking my wife's, in higher ed, and the idea of a sabbatical, where you get the equivalent of a year to kind of professional develop yourself, sure, but also like just get a break, get a chance to step out. And then similarly within the private sector, I worked at Kaplan for years. There were always other jobs that I could aspire to. And even a lateral move was a lot easier to do, to just kind of stay fresh. If you're talking about a 10, 20, 30-year career, there's a level to it. You mentioned your own 13 years, which you love, but there's a point at which, what is the next thing? And how do we start to kind of listen to teachers, the co-design and teacher voice components that you're talking about, I think are really critical, as is time management. Like there are elements of the job that are just kind of broken, so much so that you can't get to that next level conversation. Rays of hope, where do you see some positive upside here? You do strike me as someone who would make people feel more positive. You seem like your disposition alone can help people feel a little bit better. How do we start to get out of this? Where are you seeing
Yeah,
signals that maybe there is some promise on the horizon?
I'm in a very fortunate position to experience, I think, hope through action almost every working day of my career, because we are working directly with schools who are doing the work. This is not about Vital.
Mm.
We have great research. We have excellent tools. We have a team of advisors, all of whom are current or former school administrator. I mean, I'm very proud. I'm really proud of the work that we do. But we're not going to waltz into someone's building, someone's city, and just say, here, do these three things. Good luck to you. We're out. It
Yeah.
is watching the deep commitment of educational leaders and their staffs in collaboration with one another. So what's hope? Hope for us, we get year-end and mid-year data from staff that says, I am aware of the work that we are doing. I am engaged in the work that I'm doing, and I am feeling more engaged. So when I see good trends one place, I immediately turn to the idea, well, if it can go well one place, it can go well everywhere. We just need
Yeah.
to have that message. And I think the other you were asking around redesign of the job, redesign of a workday, redesign of job shares, of sabbaticals, of
Yeah.
all these innovations. I think the other glimmer of hope is that we're even having this conversation. I think thinking of teaching as a career, thinking of teaching as a workplace with
Yeah.
coworkers, a boss, like all
Yeah.
of this language of employment
Hmm.
is in and of itself a sign, I think, a sign of progress because we're
Hmm.
actually saying, okay, yeah, we need to recruit people. We need to onboard people. We need to make this a financially solvent career. But by the same token, what else can we do to engage our best thinking, our most creative, innovative thinking as it pertains to the adult side of the ledger in education? And I'm finding it to be increasingly less apologetic.
Hmm.
Like, I felt like sometimes these efforts had to be squirreled away. Like, we're going to quietly pay attention to the
Yeah.
adults,
Right.
and then we'll get back to the kids, as opposed to let's pay attention to the adults so that we can do higher quality work for our students. And so I would say that from a trend line, I'm really heartened by the quality of the work and how easy it is to have this conversation as opposed to even a decade ago,
Yeah.
where it did feel that we had this end around to really invest in our
Hmm.
educators in this way. And I think now, for better or for worse, it is a critical need, and this is a different way of looking at it,
Hmm.
at the experience people are having together.
Yeah. Makes sense. I've likened it to, on airline, on the plane, they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first before you put it on your kid. And it does feel like, coming out of COVID, and I still feel like the ripple effects and the longer term effects of the pandemic is something we really haven't fully reckoned with. I think the teaching profession in particular, I don't think was ever given the time needed to actually recover. It was just,
No,
you never get a break. It just, you have to keep running at it. And I think there's a lot of folks who still need help to kind of fully heal and be ready to come back stronger. And then at the same time, we're going to need to bring in new folks to kind of keep them in the profession. But, it does feel like COVID perhaps helped us with this awakening around mental health. And, there's a lot of concern now around Gen Z and, the anxious generation. But I think if we look at it in terms of our professions, which of them are hurting and which of them need more collective care and attention, I'd say the teaching profession is one that bubbles up. Yeah. How do we make it more of a noble profession, the noble profession that it is? How does this connect to compensation? Because that's the other topic. That's the other gorilla in the room that
yeah.
frequently shows up. How do you think about that side of things?
I just want to go back briefly to the putting your mask on
Yeah.
before you help
That's a good
others.
one, right?
Yeah, I've used that image in my own like keynoting over the years. And then I called myself out once. It dawned on me to actually think about that. So you're
Mm.
actually at 30,000 feet in the air, and the plane is shaking or listing about, and it's going to be, people are going to be screaming and the
Yeah.
masks are going to drop. And in order to follow the sane and rational advice, you are actually going to have to look your 6-year-old in the
Yeah.
eye,
Yeah.
and you're going to have to say, hang on a second.
Right.
You're going to then do this. You're going to pull the things, and you're going to do the things. And don't worry if the bag doesn't inflate. But of course, you're going to worry if the bag does.
Right.
And then you're going to reach. I mean,
Yeah.
no, it's a cute story. It looks good on a t-shirt and some post-it notes, but like, if you think about the reality of doing that, it is
Yeah.
horrifying. And therefore, I actually do agree with the analogy, because I would
Mm.
like to put it out further. If we are going to take care of educators so that they can take care of students,
Yeah.
it is going to require a moment's pause of saying, okay, well, then either at the individual level, at the organizational level, at the cultural level, we
Yeah.
are going to have to sustain ourselves so that we can sustain these tinier humans.
Yeah.
And that is in and of itself maybe a bit of a white knuckle moment of saying,
Right.
okay, we've got to pause, reflect, grow, and learn now about our conditions so that we can do this. So
Yeah.
I agree with the analogy, but I think probably warrants, a little bit of what is that reality of
Yeah.
that reinvestment,
Well, and also like maybe we should ask, and this might hit too close to home as someone who's flying in a few weeks, but we could also ask, why are so many of our planes crashing so that these oxygen masks are falling out over, school to school? The idea that a lot of folks really feel like they need an oxygen mask,
Yeah.
like the level of criticality, and then also like the desensitization that perhaps we have to permacrisis. It's almost like
Yeah.
you have to be comfortable with it's the whole "this is fine" meme where there's fire around you. That's almost become kind of a dark joke about the teaching profession, where I think it is true that one of the real, you know, qualities that we want to find in our teachers is resilience and is the ability to kind of stay steady in a crisis. But a lot of the research around just stress reactions and dealing with trauma is that you do need time to actually build yourself back up so that it can go back into the fray. And at times I worry that we don't really give our educators that chance to recharge.
Well, I think resilience and burnout, I'll use those two since we've used those in our conversation, have historically and largely been seen as individual problems to be solved by the individual.
Mhm.
So if you are burning out, you should get more sleep. You should eat your vegetables. You should go for a run. You should do all
Yeah.
these things. If you are not resilient, you should build your resiliency. Well, I think
Yeah.
both, I think those are true. I think you should get sleep. Should eat, you should do all of those things that lead to a joyful life. Vital's perspective is that burnout is the result of an environment that no level of self-care can overcome. So if you're a third grade teacher and you've gotten 6 reading curriculums in 5 years and no ask your input on, you don't need yoga and kale. You need a voice at the table that affects decisions that affect you,
Yeah.
and yoga and
Yeah,
kale.
yeah, I was gonna
But
say,
yeah,
you probably still need yoga and kale. I was gonna come
yeah.
back to that. Thank
And
you for getting
so
there. Yeah.
yeah. So I think if you hire a really great speaker for a PD day or a juggler or a comedian, great. A Taco Tuesday, lovely. Staff barbecues, wonderful. All of these things are additive.
Yeah.
But by the same token, the ways in which we operate are going to have a deeper effect on individuals. So, which means that we can actually look at burnout at scale. If we look at it, that it's an organizational design question and not an individual failing, it really can
Yeah.
allow us to flip it. I listen very closely to the language our partners use around education. Do we use like warfare language? I
Mm.
said boots on the ground a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
We talk about trenches. We talk about,
Yeah.
and digging in
Command and control. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so we have this language, this ethos, and the question is, can we flip even that sort of language? And I'll go into yoga, kale, and salary. You asked the salary question. I don't want to dodge it. I'm here in North Dakota today, and we were meeting with some rural superintendents this morning, and we toured some beautiful, wonderful schools, great communities, just a really rich environment. It was remarkably impressive. But as they think about staffing, they're thinking about housing. They're thinking about jobs for spouses. They're thinking
Mm.
about the community dynamics, in rural America around those schools, and salary, of course. I mean, even at that table, they have trusting relationships with each other. And his starting salary for his educators was less than his. And
Right.
they are a few miles apart. So that's a real thing. I would say that salary, we should pay teachers more. Full stop. End of
Yeah.
story. So that's why I'm beyond the record.
Yeah.
However, I think salary is oftentimes used as a tool maybe to do the wrong job.
Mm.
And Michael, I could hire you and I could hire you at $80,000 a year, and that would be great. But the conditions in which you are working, or the ways that you are treated, or the ways that you are sincerely and legitimately valued might be so depressed
Yep.
that what the 80 really says to you is, what's your misery worth to you?
Yeah.
Right. And you go, I hate this job. How about 100? I could toggle that up and up and up,
Yeah.
but absent a meaningful and joyful life, you're still not going to stick around.
Mm.
So in our vernacular, we're really thinking around how can we look at the total compensation, benefits, salary, and progression, as you noted, like are
Yeah.
there pathways for you to grow?
Hmm.
And can we do exceptional work at your employment experience, both and? Because the removal of either one of those integers and the equation falls apart. Great work environment and we don't pay you anything.
Yeah.
We pay you well and you have a terrible, so it has to be complementary
Yeah.
in order for the system to sustain itself.
Yeah. Makes sense. I'm talking with Nate Eklund, the founder and CEO of Vital Network, an organization that's helping schools understand teacher burnout, understand engagement, really empower teachers, get their voice, help them manage their time. It's been a wonderful conversation. Nate, as we're getting closer to conclusion here, what are some takeaways for folks who stuck with us? What are some, messages for folks as they return to the rest of their lives?
Yeah, I think we can hold this object of a great place to work in education up and we can look at it through so many different lenses. If I am a parent, as you are, I would find it curious that you have no metric by which to measure whether or not the educators in your school enjoy working and even like what retention rates are over time. So I think one thing is from a value add, I think we can do a better job in education of really being able to quantify
Mm,
sort of the experience of those adults. Because if I started a school right now, I would brand it like the best place to work in Minnesota.
yeah,
And I would
right.
see would that attract parents, students, community. That would be my proposition. If I'm an educator listening to this, first of all, I would absolve myself a little bit of whatever guilt I might have that this stress, tension, or exhaustion that I might be feeling is my problem. It might
Mm,
be if you're binging Netflix every night, you can be mindful of that. But always in that you can activate existing resources even within your school environment. Do you have a teacher leadership team? Is it well formed? Does it have a clear purpose? Are you in good concert with your school administrator? I think there are some systems that we can look that probably pre-exist, but maybe we can focus on more. And if
mm,
I'm an administrator, we think about the fact that oftentimes when we work with administrators early on in our relationship, they realize that they've been so student focused, they sort of forgot at times how much they want to index that they're going to lead these 100 people who are then going to teach those 1,000 kids. And so
yeah.
the mathematics of their job, in what ways are they supported, listened to, and developed in terms of being a great boss, being
Mm.
a great leader of adults who then are great leaders of their students. And so I think, if anything, we hope to hold up this fixed object and kind of turn it around in space because we have multiple solutions, but also multiple ways of looking at creating better environments within schools.
Amazing stuff. Doing important work. Vital Network. Nate Eklund is the founder and CEO. Hopefully, we can treat the teaching profession with the nobility and respect that it deserves. Nate, thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Thank you so much. Wonderful conversations.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.